Now we're ready to attach some hardware. So we're first going to mark the placement for the strap arches and the handles. First you're going to measure in 2.5 inches from each of the side edges and mark a vertical line. Then you're going to measure up from the bottom 5.5 inches and also 8.5 inches, and you're going to mark 2 horizontal lines. And you can choose to mark them all the way across. It's a little bit easier of a visual, or it's most important to just mark them along that vertical line that you made, so then you have an intersecting point. So our goal is to install the strap arches on either side of the bag like this, and our handles are going to go through the arch opening. So these are just meant to be decorative, and they also help hold your handle up straight too. So you'll want to make sure that the prongs are straight. Sometimes they get bent outwards a little bit. You can set those aside. And included with each strap arch is a washer. And this not only holds the hardware in place, but we're going to use it as a template for our prongs. So take one of the arches and test it to see which holes the prongs poked through. So my prongs poke through the second hole in on each side. Sometimes, depending on what the factory sends us, there are different washers. So you might have different size washers, but they'll all work for the hardware. So you're gonna place that washer on the 8.5 inch line that we marked earlier, and then my prong poked through the second hole on each side. So I'm going to place that second hole along the vertical line, but then I'm also going to mark the second hole on the left side. This will help us cut the slits for the prongs. And you'll do the same on the other side. Now, when I've taught this bag in classes, some students wanted to have their strap arches spaced a little farther apart. So if you test this on your bag right now before we cut the slits, that prong is going to poke through on the vertical line along the horizontal line on each side. So that gives you an idea of how big of an opening in between the hardware you'll have for putting things in. Normally this pocket is handy for putting a magazine or sunglasses or your cell phone. So if need be, you can move the hardware according to where you want it positioned. Too far apart, the handle won't look quite right, so you might have to make a longer handle. But I'd say if you'd center the hardware on the vertical lines, then you'd have a larger opening and your handle will still look like how it does on the pattern. You don't want to go too close to the edge. I'd make sure that you stay at least 1 inch or 1.5 inches away from each of the side edges, because you have to account for seam allowance later on, and you want to make sure that hardware is enough out of the way. But I'm going to install my hardware exactly how the pattern is. So after you have your prongs marked, then you're going to use a seam ripper and cut a slit through all the layers where each of the prongs are going to poke through. And start small with your slits. You can always make your slit bigger, but you want to make sure that your hardware has a nice tight fit. You don't want it to be loose at all. And one other tip, if you're afraid of cutting your fabric and going too far, you could take a pin and put it on the top of where your slit will be. And then as you poke through with your seam ripper and push up, it will stop at that pin and it won't cut any further. So you can use that as a precaution if you'd like. Then you're going to take your hardware, poke it through the slits that you cut, and you'll flip it over to the wrong side. Place the washer over the prongs, and then bend the prongs away from the center. And And if you'd like, you could take a scrap of that fusible interfacing from before and iron it over the back side of your hardware, and that will help prevent your bag from being scratched from the hardware at all. And then you'll do the same for the remaining arch on the front of the bag, and then you'll install 2 strap arches on the back side of your bag as well. And then we're ready to move on to the next step. After you have your strap arches installed and all your markings on each half of the bag, we're going to start with one side of the bag and attach one of our handles that we made earlier. So take one of your cork fabric handles and have the right side face up of your fabric and your handle, and you're going to feed each end of the handle through one of the strap arches. And the point end of the handle will be in line with that 5.5 inch mark, and then the side edge of your handle will be even with the 2.5 inch mark. So that'll help be a guide to make sure that your end of your handle is straight. And you'll do the same for the opposite side. Now, since we can't use pins on cork fabric, either you can hold this in place as you sew. Otherwise, you could use some of that double-sided basting tape that I showed you earlier. You can adhere it to the center back and just stick it in place. Or you could even try sewing with some paper tape. And so this tape you can sew right through, so you can position your handle and then just tape it in place. And you can sew right over the paper tape and it will tear off after you're done sewing. So I'm going to do the paper tape option, and you're going to top stitch each end of your handle in place. And you're going to sew starting at the hardware, have your presser foot as far back as you can, and you're going to sew with an 1/8 inch seam allowance down the side, along the tapered end, back up the side, and you'll stop sewing where you started and sew across the handle. If you did not add any strap arches, you'll start at the 8.5 inch line with an 1/8 inch seam allowance and sew down the side, taper end, back up to the 8.5 inch line and sew across. So a little bit different depending on if you chose to use the hardware or not. And you'll do this for each side of the bag. So I've switched over to the narrow foot on my machine, and this will help me keep an even 1/8 inch seam allowance for my top stitching. You could also use a zipper foot. So either of those I recommend for top stitching the end of the handles. And it's tempting to sew across the very top edge and right close to the hardware. However, when you get to the edge, the side edge, and you go to pivot, you're going to hit the hardware and you aren't going to be able to sew that. So I recommend to start as far back as your presser foot will allow on the right hand side of the handle. And then you'll back stitch and sew down the side. And then you'll come up the opposite side and you'll stop stitching across from where you started and then sew across the handle there. And then you'll repeat for the opposite side. We can take our paper off, and you repeat the same steps to attach the handle to the front of your bag.